Hello everyone, it's Hunter. Welcome to my channel. The night of September 1984 resulted in the tragic death of a loving mother of three. Was it a robbery gone bad or an intentional murder? In Ocean County, New Jersey, is Toms River. Maria and Robert were high school sweethearts that met at a high school party and were members of Toms River's affluential. Robert Oakley Marshall was born December 16, 1939. He was an American businessman, an insurance broker. He was described as overbearing, arrogant, and egocentric at times. Maria Marshall was married to Robert Marshall in 1963. She grew up in Philadelphia and her father was a doctor. She was described as a striking blonde who had an easygoing personality and was a loving and supportive mother. Maria was a stay-at-home mom to their three sons. Their three sons were Robbie Marshall, who was 19 at the time, Christopher Marshall, who was 18, and John Marshall, who was 13. The family had moved to the Brookside section of Toms River in 1973, and they belonged to the local country club. The family liked to travel to Atlantic City to gamble on a regular basis, especially Rob. Toms River to Atlantic City is about a 57-minute drive down the Garden State Parkway. Around 12:30 a.m. on September 7th, 1984, a man is desperately trying to flag down passing vehicles near the entrance to the Oyster Creek picnic area along the Garden State Parkway. When a car finally stopped, he told them his wife had been shot and to call the police. The occupants drove to the nearest available payphone and notified the police. They then returned to the area and found Robert walking around with what appeared to be a head wound. His wife, Maria, lay dead on the front seat of their 1980 Cadillac Eldorado. When the police arrived, Rob told them that they had been traveling back from Atlantic City. He felt that one of their rear tires began to feel funny, so he pulled off the parkway into Oyster Creek picnic area. This area is a ways off the road. There are no lights and it's heavily wooded, with a sign at the entry that says, "To be closed at dusk." The police checked Maria for a pulse, but they could find none. Rob told the police that while he was bending down to look at the tire, he was hit on the head and knocked unconscious. When he awoke, the money that he had won at the casino was gone, and Maria was dead. Rob was taken to the hospital to get his head injury looked at. He received 5 stitches. Soon, a priest arrived, took Rob home. They got there at 3 a.m. and they broke the news to Robbie and John. Robert's story to his sons was that someone must have followed them from the casino to rob them. The police arrived a short time after Rob had returned home. They asked him to come with them to the state police barracks to make a formal statement. Rob's version remained the same, that someone must have followed them from the casino and seen that he had won more than $2,000 at the blackjack table. This person or persons followed them into the picnic area where he had gone to check his tire. He was knocked unconscious, and when he awoke, he was bleeding and his money was gone from his pants pocket. Maria was face down across the front seat of the car in a puddle of blood. Before the tragedy, Robert and Maria seemed to be a perfect couple, at 44 and 42, having been high school sweethearts. But their perfect marriage was a mirage. Maria's brother, Rob's brother-in-law, told him that Maria knew that he was having an affair. She found hotel receipts and phone bills showing a number for a local high school where a married vice principal, Saran Krishna, was employed. Over 50 calls a month were made. Robert admitted to it, stating that he was having a midlife crisis and was feeling depressed and bored with his work life, and that he and Saran were in love. He also admitted to to having some financial difficulties. They were over $300,000 in debt, which would roughly be about $747,000 today. Keep in mind, Robert had a gross income of $130,000. His need for a certain lifestyle was more than his income could support. By August 1984, no banks or credit card companies would extend loans or increase his spending limit. He blamed it on Maria's spending habits. Maria had knew all along, and she was going to confront Rob on Monday, September the 10th. His brother-in-law dropped one more bombshell. Maria had hired a private detective to follow Rob. Rob's response was that if only he had known about the detective, then none of this would have happened. When he was questioned what did he mean by that, Rob deflected, saying that if Maria knew about the affair already, then he would have left her sooner, and they wouldn't have been in Atlantic City that night. The brother-in-law then asked him if he had any life insurance out on Maria, to which he replied that he did, and that it was a good sales strategy. After all, he was an insurance salesman. According to Rob, the insurance on Maria's life at the time of her death was $1.5 million. At the end of the conversation, Rob's brother-in-law gave him some sage advice. First, tell the boys about the affair before they hear about it on the news. Second, him having worked for State Attorney General's office, he pointed out the way that this was looking and told him to get a lawyer, which Rob had already did. There were a few members of Rob's inner circle who weren't buying what Rob was trying to sell. They questioned why would he stop at the Oyster Creek picnic area. It was dark, secluded, when 4 miles up the road was a 24-hour fast food restaurant. Others that knew Rob never saw him lift a finger in manual labor and couldn't see him changing a tire. Another issue was that within hours of Maria's murder, Rob had her body cremated, and that occurred before the prosecutor's office or state police could prevent her body from being released. Maria's autopsy showed 2 bullet wounds about 3 millimeters apart that made entry into her back. She had an exit wound to the front of her chest and another through her left breast. These bullet wounds were made at close range. A .45 caliber bullet was lodged in her left forearm. When the shooting occurred, Maria had been lying down with her left arm under her. The cause of death was massive hemorrhaging due to the left lung and main artery of the chest being lacerated. Police investigators impounded the Cadillac Eldorado, and upon examination, the rear tire had a clean 1-inch cut in the sidewalk. It looked like it had been slit open by a knife. Police investigators were contacted by Maria's bankruptcy and divorce lawyer. When it came time to move forward with the proceedings, Maria decided to try and save her marriage and to hold off on doing anything. The lawyer gave detectives a note Maria gave him, stating she had more information, and this included 3 telephone numbers with the Louisiana area code. Police also brought in Saran Krishna, even going so far as to handcuff and fingerprint her. She got a lawyer immediately. She did talk with the police, telling them that she and Robert had begun their affair in June 1983. They were planning on leaving both their spouses in the near future. She also shared that Robert had asked her if she knew of anyone who could get rid of Maria. That would solve all his problems. She claimed that she told him she didn't know of anyone except for one woman. This woman's family allegedly had ties to organized crime, and if Rob was serious, then she could not be with him. The police tracked down one of the numbers belonging to a Robert Cumber. He was a hardware clerk in Louisiana. Police paid Cumber a visit and brought him to local authorities for more questioning. Cumber stated that in May of 1984, he met both Robert and Maria Marshall at a birthday party of a family friend. Now, this family friend is the person with the alleged ties to organized crime. Robert Marshall and Cumber got to talking about IRAs and if Cumber knew anyone he could hire as an investigator, as he didn't want anyone that's local. Robert Marshall was referred to Billy McKinnon. Billy agreed to come to Atlantic City and meet Robert Marshall for $5,000. Billy was a former police detective. Police went to New Jersey to the Marshall residence and spoke to Rob, so Ron was present. They asked him if he knew or had heard of the names Jimmy Davis or Billy Wayne. Rob was visibly shaken up but stated that, on the advice of his attorney, he was not to answer any questions. Days later, the Marshall's son, Robbie, took a phone message from Jimmy Davis, asking that his father, Rob Marshall, contact him right away. Upon relaying the message to his dad, Rob, who was with Saran at her beach condo, told his son that he had met Davis a long time ago when he had lost a basketball game and he had wired Davis his winnings. He wasn't sure why he was contacting him now. His son pointed out that his father never watched any NBA games. On September the 26th, 1984, news broke that Robert Cumber was indicted by a grand jury in Ocean County on the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in connection with Maria Marshall's death. Cumber's role was to pass messages, 31 in fact, between Robert Marshall and Billy McKinnon. The messages were primarily Rob asking McKinnon to call him. Cumber was a former Air Force clerk and a current hardware store clerk that had no criminal history up until that point. He was convicted in 1986 as being an accomplice and received 30 years in prison with no chance of parole. Cumber could have faced a lesser charge if he had taken a plea, but he didn't. He took his chances at trial, which did not work out well for him. Soon after Cumber's indictment, Saran Kroshner ended her relationship with Robert Marshall. This was allegedly done on the advice of counsel. In 2006, Cumber received clemency from Governor Richard Cody after serving 20 years. At the age of 68, he was reunited with his wife and daughter. On September the 27th, Rob Marshall checked into room 16 of the Best Western Hotel in Lakewood and recorded 3 messages, one for each of his sons and for his brother-in-law. He planned on committing suicide, but fell asleep after mixing 50 Restorol sleeping pills in a can of Coca-Cola. Ocean County detectives who had been assigned to watch Robert contacted a local rescue squad. They feared that when he failed to answer a call placed to his room at 1 a.m. that he may take his own life. Robert was transported to a local hospital and he was fine. His attorney had him transported to a psychiatric facility near Philadelphia. Police confiscated the tapes. From their investigation, this is what police put together. Robert Marshall and Billy McKinnon met on June the 18th, 1984 at a casino in Atlantic City. Marshall offered to pay Billy $65,000 to kill his wife. This was in addition to the $5,000 that was already paid. Rob wanted the hit to be carried out that night, but McKinnon did not want to, and so he returned back to LA. On July the 19th, 1984, McKinnon went back to Atlantic City. He met up with Robert Marshall, and Rob insisted that he wanted the job to be done that night, when he and Maria would be out. Marshall's plan was that he would leave Maria in the car and he would go into the restaurant to use their facilities. And while he was away from the car, a hit would be carried out, and it would be made to look like a failed robbery. However, the plan failed, mostly because Marshall chose a well-lit and busy parking lot. Robert was desperate. He wanted to have the murder completed. He offered McKinnon an extra $15,000 if he would come back before Labor Day. McKinnon did so on September the 6th, 1984. He met up with Robert at a service parking area located south of Toms River. They scouted for a site where the murder could be carried out, and it would be made to look like a failed robbery. At 12:30 p.m. on the day of the murder, Robert pulled into the pre-arranged meeting spot. McKinnon had already dropped off the shooter, Larry Thompson, at the picnic area. Thompson was a mechanic by trade from Louisiana. The plan was executed. Rob was hit on the head, and Maria was shot twice in the back and died soon after. January the 28th, 1986, the trials of Robert Marshall and Larry Thompson commenced in Atlantic County. Both were charged with first-degree murder with special circumstances. It was going to be a death penalty case. Billy McKinnon turned state star witness. In a plea deal for a lighter sentence of 5 years in prison, he testified against Robert and Larry. 8 insurance companies also testified to Marshall taking out policies in the year prior to Maria's murder. Robert Marshall took the stand in his defense. One of the questions that the prosecutors asked that really stuck out to me was, why were Maria's remains still in a box at the funeral home? Robert replied that they were planning on burying her in Florida, but he got arrested before that could happen. But Rob had 3 months since Maria's funeral until his arrest to at least pick up her ashes from the funeral home. He did not. Instead, he went to Florida by himself and began a relationship with a woman named Karen Odell. Here's the surprise kicker. Karen and her husband had lived in Toms River prior to moving to Florida and had been friends with the Marshalls. In the closing arguments, Prosecutor Kelly stated, "The defendant is a coward, he's self-centered, he's greedy, he's desperate, materialistic, and a liar." On March 5, 1986, Robert Marshall was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. This came after a 25-minute penalty phase hearing 2 days later. Larry Thompson was acquitted of being the actual shooter, and he walked free after the judge read the verdicts. Robert Marshall spent 18 years on New Jersey's death row, but he was resentenced to 30 years with the eligibility of parole in 2006 due to a federal court's decision regarding ineffective counsel in his 1986 trial. He was granted his first parole board hearing that was scheduled for the 18th of March 2015. However, Marshall wasn't able to meet the board because he died on February the 24th from natural causes. He was 75 years old. He never admitted his guilt or showed any remorse for his actions, only stating that he had made mistakes. The question remains, who shot Maria Marshall? Well, unsurprisingly, it was Larry Thompson. In 2014, when he was 71 years old, he admitted to his part in the murder, to being the actual shooter. He had served 12 years on a 50-year prison sentence in Louisiana State Penitentiary for a 2003 armed car robbery and his part in the attempted murder of a police officer. Due to the double jeopardy rule, Thompson couldn't be prosecuted again. Double jeopardy is a rule in the U.S. Constitution that a person cannot be tried twice for the same crime after a verdict of not guilty has been rendered by a judge or jury. The murder of Maria Marshall was subject of the best-selling 1989 book called Blind Faith by author Joe McGinnis, which in 1990 was adapted into an NBC Emmy-nominated miniseries made of the same name, starring Robert Urich and Joanna Kearns. Robert Marshall was selfish and greedy. Even up until his death, he couldn't confess and own up to his involvement and orchestration of Maria's murder. He took a mother away from her young sons, and they had to spend the rest of their adult lives without her because of him.